He didn't know where to look the first time he met her. By the time he left, he couldn't stop coming back. Grady Milner sat in his truck outside a squat brick building for a full 90 seconds before he actually cut the engine, running through the delivery manifest on his clipboard one more time, even though he already knew exactly what was in the crate riding in his truck bed, because showing up somewhere new always made him do this particular kind of stalling, checking things he'd already checked twice just to put off walking through a door he didn't know yet. The sign on the building read Palisade Prosthetics and Orthotics in simple block letters. And this was the fourth stop on a Tuesday route that used to belong to a guy named Dennis who transferred to the shop's night shift 2 weeks back, which was how Grady had ended up inheriting a client he'd never met and a batch of hardware he'd personally machined but never seen installed on anything. He was 32, a tool maker at Halverson Precision, a 15-person shop that subcontracted custom components for half a dozen different industries, and most weeks that meant agricultural fittings or hydraulic couplings, parts that ended up bolted into machinery. Grady would never lay eyes on again once they left the shop floor. The prosthetics account was newer, maybe 8 months on the books, small but steady, pyramid connectors and socket adapters and alignment hardware machined to tolerances tighter than almost anything else that came through the shop. Because a connector riding a couple thousandths out of true wasn't just a bad part. It was somebody's whole gate thrown off every single step they took on it. Grady had machined this particular batch himself 2 days earlier, 6 titanium pyramid adapters and a run of 4-hole alignment plates, checking each one twice on the coordinate measuring machine before it went in the crate. The same habit he brought to everything, whether or not anybody was watching him do it. He'd grown up around this kind of work, his own father having run a small tool and die operation out of a rented bay for 20-some years before arthritis finally forced him to sell the equipment off piece by piece, and Grady had learned the trade standing next to him from about age 14 on, absorbing the particular respect his father held for anybody who actually used the parts they built, rather than just move them along the supply chain. It made him a careful machinist and a quiet one, more comfortable running a lathe than making conversation, which was part of why a route full of new faces wasn't exactly his favorite part of the job. He grabbed the crate off the tailgate, hoisted it against one hip, and walked it up to the clinic's side door marked Deliveries, and a buzzer led him into a waiting room that smelled like rubbing alcohol and fresh carpet glue, empty except for a rack of magazines and a small fish tank bubbling in the corner. A woman came out from the back a moment later, wiping her hands on a shop rag, dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, wearing safety glasses pushed up on her forehead the way people do when they've just stepped away from a bench. "You must be Dennis's replacement," she said, setting the rag down on the front counter. "I'm Ronnie. I run fabrication back there. Halverson usually sends the same guy. Figured I'd get a new face eventually." "Grady," he said, setting the crate down on the counter between them. "Dennis moved to nights. I got his Tuesday route. Should be 6 pyramid adapters and 4 alignment plates. Titanium. I ran the tolerances myself yesterday." Ronnie pulled a packing slip off the top of the crate and scanned it, then reached in and lifted one of the adapters out, turning it over in her hand with the kind of quick, practiced inspection Grady recognized instantly. The same motion he used checking his own work at the shop, thumb running along an edge feeling for a burr that shouldn't be there. "Nice finish on this," she said, more to herself than to him. Dennis usually left a little chatter on the pyramid seat, had to hand lap it before it'd make clean. "This one's already true." "Ran it at a slower feed rate than spec calls for," Grady said. "Takes longer, but you get a cleaner seat without needing to lap it after." Ronnie looked up at him for the first time, really looking, not just at the part in her hand, and something in her expression shifted, mild interest replacing the professional politeness from 30 seconds earlier. "You actually adjust for that on your own? Or did somebody tell you to?" "Nobody tells me anything at that shop," Grady said. "I just don't like handing off a part I'd have to fix myself if I were on the other end of it." It was around then, reaching to set the adapter back in the crate, that Ronnie's sleeve rode up a couple of inches, and Grady's eyes caught the line where her right forearm ended in a socket instead of a hand. The prosthesis itself, a matte carbon fiber shell with a mechanical wrist joint, practical and unadorned, clearly built for function rather than looking like anything close to a real hand. He didn't mean to stare, wasn't even sure he had, but something in the half-second pause before he looked back up at her face gave it away anyway. That particular beat of not knowing exactly where a person's eyes were supposed to land. And Grady felt his ears go warm, the way they did whenever he'd said something wrong without meaning to. Ronnie clocked it instantly, the way she clocked it every single time. And instead of letting the silence sit there getting more awkward by the second, she just held the prosthesis up slightly, matter of fact, like she was pointing out a tool on the bench rather than a piece of her own body. Myoelectric on the bad days. This one's the mechanical backup. Easier for shop work since I'm not worried about grease getting into the sensor pads. She said it the same flat, informational way she talked about the pyramid seats finished 30 seconds earlier. No drama in it, no invitation for him to apologize or explain himself. You can ask if you want. Most people either stare and say nothing or ask something so far out in left field I have to explain the whole thing from scratch anyway. How long, Shawnee? Grady asked, deciding the direct question beat pretending he hadn't noticed anything at all. 6 years, Ronnie said. Press accident at a stamping plant. Wasn't paying close enough attention on a Friday afternoon shift, and it cost me most of my right forearm. Spent about 1.5 years figuring out prosthetics from the patient side before I decided I liked the mechanical part of it more than I ever liked stamping sheet metal. Went back to school for orthotics and prosthetic certification. Been here almost 4 years now. She set the adapter down and picked up her clipboard, all business again. Funny thing about losing a hand in a machine shop, you come out the other side knowing exactly how a socket adapter's supposed to fit because you've worn 6 different versions of one yourself. Grady nodded slowly, filing that away, and something about the flat, unbothered way she'd laid the whole thing out. No bid for sympathy, no performance of tragedy, made it easier to just move past it the way she clearly wanted him to. Makes sense you'd notice a bad pyramid seat faster than most people ordering parts. I notice everything about a bad seat, Ronnie said, something dry creeping into her voice. I've had to walk around on one. You learn real quick what a couple thousandths of misalignment feels like after 8 hours on your feet. I'll keep running them slow then, Grady said. Didn't realize I was machining parts for somebody who'd actually feel the difference. Most guys don't think about it that way, Ronnie said. And something in how she said it, not quite a compliment but close enough to one, made Grady realize he'd been standing in this waiting room a solid 5 minutes longer than an actual delivery required. She walked him back through a set of double doors into the fabrication shop itself, technically not part of the delivery but offered without much ceremony. Just, you want to see where these actually end up, or you got other stops. And Grady, who did have other stops on Dennis's old route, found himself saying he had a few minutes anyway. The back room looked less like a medical clinic and more like a small machine shop crossed with a plaster mold room, a vacuum-forming rig against one wall, shelves of raw carbon fiber sheet and resin cans, and a workbench cluttered with test sockets in various stages of trimming, each one shaped for a specific patient's residual limb, cast and adjusted and cast again until the fit was right. This one's for a kid, 12 years old, born without most of his left hand, Ronnie said, nodding at a small, partially finished device clamped in a vise. Myoelectric, reads muscle signals off his forearm, took us 4 fittings to get the socket comfortable enough that he'll actually wear it instead of leaving it in a drawer. Kids are honest about that in a way adults aren't. They just won't wear something that hurts. Doesn't matter how impressive the technology is. You build the whole thing here? Grady asked, genuinely curious now, looking at the bench full of half-finished components. Socket and fitting, yeah, that's the custom part. Has to match the exact shape of whoever's wearing it, Ronnie said. The mechanical hardware, the joints and connectors, that's where guys like you come in. I could probably learn to machine titanium myself given enough time, but honestly, I'd rather spend that time getting a socket fit right. So I let Halverson handle the parts I can order to spec instead of hand building from scratch. She nodded toward a corkboard pinned above the workbench. Crowded with photos, a toddler taking her first steps on a small pediatric leg, a middle-aged man mid-swing on a golf course, the 12-year-old grinning with his new hand raised in a fist. That's the part that keeps me here, she said. Every one of those started as a bad fitting and a lot of frustrated patients. Same as your parts, honestly. You don't see the finished product roll off the shop floor either. Two different kinds of precision, Grady said. You're matching a shape nobody else has. I'm matching a number on a print. Guess we're both spending our whole day making sure something fits exactly right or somebody ends up in pain, Ronnie said. And something about the plainness of that observation, unromantic and entirely accurate, sat with Grady the rest of the drive to his next stop in a way he didn't examine too closely at the time. By the time he made it back to his truck, checking his phone for the next address on Dennis's old route, Ronnie had already gone back to the 12-year-old socket, elbow deep in trimming resin at the bench without a backward glance. And Grady sat there another second longer than he needed to before starting the engine, thinking about a pyramid seat machined a little too slow on purpose, and a woman who'd noticed it in about 4 seconds flat. He ran the next 3 stops on Dennis's old route mostly on autopilot, a hydraulic fitting drop at a farm equipment dealer, and 2 smaller pickups that barely registered, his mind circling back more than once to the corkboard full of photographs in the particular way Ronnie had talked about a 12-year-old socket fit like it mattered more than anything else that had happened to her that week, which, knowing what he now knew about her own 6 years, it probably did. He was back the following Tuesday with the next batch, same time, same crate, and Ronnie met him at the counter again like it was already a routine instead of a first repeat visit. Halverson keeping you on this route permanently, or am I getting a different stranger next month? She asked, signing the packing slip without really looking at it. Told my supervisor I'd take it regular, Grady said, which was true, though he left out the part where he'd volunteered for it specifically, framing it to himself the whole drive over as just wanting consistency on a growing account. Nothing more complicated than that. Figured somebody who actually knows what these parts do ought to be the one bringing them. Somebody who runs a slow feed rate on purpose without being told to, Ronnie said, the corner of her mouth pulling up slightly as she set the new adapter against the light to check the seat. Same practiced motion as the week before. I could get used to that kind of consistency. Same time next Tuesday then, Grady said, and found himself already thinking about it on the drive back to the shop. Turning over the particular unhurried way she'd said used to like, it meant something worth paying attention to. 6 weeks into the Tuesday delivery route, Ronnie Castellano had stopped pretending the appointment was really about pyramid adapters, and so had Grady Milner, though neither of them had said as much out loud yet, both content to let a standing work visit slowly turn into something neither the packing slip nor the delivery manifest had a box to check for. What started as a route reassignment turned into the week, Grady finally worked up the nerve to ask for something that wasn't on Halverson's invoice, and the week Ronnie found out exactly how fast a good thing could still go sideways, even when nobody meant for it to. The 6 weeks had built themselves out of small, practical additions to what had started as a straightforward delivery. Grady had taken to arriving 15, sometimes 20 minutes before he strictly needed to, and Ronnie had taken to saving her hardest fabrication problems for Tuesday mornings instead of solving them alone on a Wednesday, both of them treating the extra time as a professional courtesy, neither one examined too closely. She'd shown him how a check socket got vacuum formed over a positive plaster mold, the whole shop filling with the sharp chemical smell of catalyzed resin, while a sheet of clear thermoplastic softened under a heat gun before she draped it and pulled vacuum to shrink it tight against the shape. And Grady had shown her, one slow Tuesday when a batch came back out of spec, exactly how a coordinate measuring machine could catch a taper error invisible to the naked eye, walking her through the readout on his laptop like it was the most natural thing in the world to be teaching a client his own quality control process. Some Tuesdays they didn't talk shop at all, just fell into the kind of easy back and forth that had nothing to do with either of their jobs. Ronnie ribbing him about the same faded Halverson polo he wore every single week like the company only issued him one. Grady admitting he owned exactly 4 of the identical shirt and rotated them without much thought, which made Ronnie laugh hard enough that she had to set down the socket she was trimming. Other weeks he'd linger by the corkboard of patient photos asking about specific ones, the toddler now walking well enough to chase a dog around a backyard, the golfer who'd shaved 4 strokes off his handicap since his last fitting, and Ronnie found herself telling him things about her patients. She didn't usually bother explaining to people outside the clinic, because he actually wanted to know the follow-up, instead of just nodding politely through it. The hardest problem came in on a Tuesday in late October. A patient with an unusually short residual limb who needed a socket and adapter combination nobody in Ronnie's usual catalog quite solved. Not enough length for a standard pyramid mount without the whole assembly sitting too low for the patient's natural knee height. Ronnie had the socket fit dialed in perfectly, the actual limb interface exactly right, but the hardware stack underneath kept coming up short no matter how she juggled the standard components, and she was still turning it over when Grady showed up with the week's delivery and found her hunched over a half-built test leg with 3 different adapter combinations laid out on the bench like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit. "Talk me through the problem instead of the parts," Grady said, setting the crate down and pulling up a stool without being asked. "Residual limbs 4 inches shorter than what these adapters are built to stack for," Ronnie said, gesturing at the components. "Standard pyramid needs a minimum clearance I don't have, and if I go with the low-profile option, the whole thing loses rigidity under load. Patient's an active guy, plays in a rec basketball league. I'm not sending him out on hardware that'll flex under a hard landing." Grady picked up one of the adapters, turning it over, running his thumb along the same edge he always checked out of habit. "What if we went through Halverson's custom prosthetic program? We've got FDA clearance for custom height pyramid adapters under our Class 1 exemption. I just need to submit the specs through our quality system, get it logged as a custom device, run it through our ISO protocol," Grady said. "Paperwork takes a day, machining takes another day. I could have it back to you by Friday if you can get me the exact clearance measurement and patient prescription." Ronnie looked up at him properly for the first time since he'd walked in. "You'd run a full custom device order for one patient? That's got to be 10 times the paperwork of a standard part." "We do it for complex cases all the time. It's already in our quality management system," Grady said. "Just usually goes through a distributor instead of direct to a clinic. I can walk it through faster if I submit it myself. Bring me the exact clearance number you need and I'll have it back to you by Thursday." He delivered the custom adapter 2 days later, coordinating with his supervisor to add an off-schedule delivery run, driving out Thursday afternoon because he didn't want the patient waiting an extra week for something Ronnie needed sooner. And when she test-fitted against the socket, the whole assembly finally sat at the right height, rigid and clean, exactly the fix the standard catalog couldn't offer. "You built this on your own clock," Ronnie said, turning the finished leg to check the alignment from every angle. She ran her thumb along the machine surface the same way she checked every piece of hardware that came through the shop, feeling for anything that might catch or bind under load, and found nothing. The shortened pyramid seat every bit as clean as the standard parts he'd been running for her since that first Tuesday. The patient came in for his fitting that Friday, took 3 laps around the parking lot, testing the height before breaking into a grin wide enough that Ronnie had to look away for a second. And she texted Grady a single photo of the guy mid-stride with no caption at all, because some things didn't need one. "Wasn't going to make your guy wait a week playing basketball on hardware that might flex," Grady said, like the extra hours hadn't been a real decision at all. It was 2 Tuesdays after that, both of them standing at the counter after another routine delivery, that Grady finally said the thing he'd been circling for over a month. "There's a barbecue place on 5th that does a Thursday special. Brisket by the pound. Wasn't going to bring a crate this time. Just wondering if you'd want to go. Actual date, not a delivery." Ronnie's face did something complicated, pleased and a little wary at once. The particular expression of somebody who'd heard some version of this question before and wanted to trust it more than she fully did yet. "Yeah," she said. "I'd like that." Ronnie ordering the burnt ends without hesitation, and Grady admitting he'd never once been brave enough to try them, both of them working through a tray of brisket and cornbread at a sticky picnic table, while a country station played too loud from a speaker mounted over the pickup window. Thursday came, and it went well, easy in the way their Tuesdays had already been easy, brisket and dry humor and no awkward silences. And it was near the end of the night, walking back toward her car, that Grady brought up his sister's birthday coming up that weekend, a big family cookout his whole extended crew would be at, and asked almost too casually whether Ronnie might want to come along. He said yes with his mouth and something else entirely, with a half-second pause before he said it. A flicker Ronnie had learned to read years ago in exactly this kind of moment. The small hitch that happened right before a person started doing math about explanations and introductions and how a whole unfamiliar family might react to a woman with a prosthetic arm at their table. Grady covered it fast, recovered his voice within a breath, said something about checking his sister's exact plans first, but Ronnie had already clocked the pause, filed at the same instant. Sharp way she filed a bad pyramid seat. "You don't have to invite me to that," Ronnie said, keeping her voice level, testing the water carefully. "I want to," Grady said, too quick now, overcorrecting in the other direction. "Just wasn't sure if big family stuff is your speed this early. Wasn't trying to make it weird." "It's already a little weird," Ronnie said, and something in her had gone careful and measured in a way it hadn't been all night. "I've done this before, Grady. Not the exact same version, but close enough. Guy's interested, guy's easy to be around, guy says all the right things right up until it's time to actually bring me into the parts of his life that matter. Family, friends, the people whose opinion he actually cares about, and then something gets real quiet real fast. Not cruel about it, usually, just quiet. A canceled plan here, a delayed text there, until eventually it's just over and nobody ever has to say why." "That's not what that pause was," Grady said, and he sounded like he meant it, though the words came out a little too fast to land with full conviction yet. "Maybe not," Ronnie said, "but I need you to actually understand why I noticed it in the first place, instead of just telling me I'm wrong about what I saw. 6 years of this, Grady. I know exactly what that half second looks like on somebody's face, because I've watched it happen in real time more times than I can count. At bars, at family dinners, in doorways where a guy's shaking my left hand instead of the one I actually offered because he panicked and grabbed whichever one was closest. I'm not saying you're one of those guys. I'm saying I don't know yet, and I've gotten real careful about finding out the hard way." Grady was quiet for a second, turning that over, and Ronnie could see him deciding whether to argue his way out of it or actually sit with what she just told him. "I don't have a clean answer for you tonight," he said finally. "The hesitation was real. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But it wasn't about your arm. It was about me never having brought anybody to one of these things before, period, and not knowing if I'm actually any good at the parts of a relationship that happen outside a machine shop or a barbecue joint." "Maybe that's true," Ronnie said, not unkindly, just honest. "But I can't tell the difference from where I'm standing yet, and I'm not going to keep showing up to something that might just be the same story with better dialogue. I need some room to figure out if this is different before I let myself want it to be." "Okay," Grady said, and didn't argue, didn't reach for her, just stood there in the parking lot letting the silence be what it actually was. Instead of rushing to fill it with reassurance, he wasn't sure yet he'd earned the right to give. "I'll still be there Tuesday, same crate, same route, whether or not you want to talk about any of this." "I know you will," Ronnie said. And there was something almost sad in how easily she believed that part, the professional consistency, even while she still doubted the rest. She got in her car, and Grady stood in the lot a while after her taillights disappeared, running the whole conversation back in his head, trying to figure out how a barbecue invitation had turned into the most honest conversation he'd had with anybody in years, and whether he actually had it in him to prove, over time instead of in one parking lot speech, that he was different from every guy who'd gone quiet on her before. He thought about his father, too, standing in that rented shop bay, explaining once that the whole trick to machining anything worth trusting was patience under pressure, not rushing a cut just because the clock said, "You should be further along by now." And it occurred to Grady sitting alone in his truck that the same principle probably applied to a lot more than titanium. 3 Tuesdays into the distance Ronnie Castellano had asked for, Grady Milner showed up at Palisade Prosthetics with the usual crate of pyramid adapters riding in his truck bed and one extra item wrapped in a shop rag sitting on the passenger seat. Something he'd machined on his own time over 2 nights that had nothing to do with any invoice Halverson Precision had ever cut. What started as 3 weeks of careful, respectful space turned into the morning. Ronnie finally understood the difference between a man who talked about paying attention and a man who actually did it, down to a tolerance most people would never think to notice. The 3 weeks had gone exactly the way Grady told her they would. No dramatics, no flood of texts, trying to argue his way back into her trust. He still made the delivery every week, right on time, professional and steady, and Ronnie started to notice the consistency itself was doing more work than any apology could have. He never pushed for a verdict, just kept handing over clean parts and taking her fabrication problem seriously, and that patience was the thing that started wearing down her guard one Tuesday at a time. She'd use the time the way she needed to, running the whole parking lot conversation back in her head more times than she'd admit, separating out the parts that were actually about Grady from the parts that were really about every other guy who'd worn the same easy warmth right up until it mattered and then quietly hadn't. What Ronnie hadn't told Grady, because it had never seemed worth mentioning at the time, was a small complaint she'd made in passing back in September, weeks before any of this started, about her mechanical backup arm's wrist joint, how repositioning it for different tasks meant stopping whatever she was doing, digging a 2mm hex key out of her supply drawer, loosening the friction collar, rotating the wrist by hand, and retightening it. A whole clumsy process every single time she switched from fine trim work to something that needed a different angle. She'd mentioned it once, mid-sentence, half a joke about how the manufacturer clearly never asked an actual user before designing the collar, and moved on to something else entirely. Grady, it turned out, had not moved on from it at all. Ronnie unwrapped the shop rag and found a wrist collar, machined aluminum, smaller and more refined than the stock part on her own prosthetic, with a knurled ring where the stock version had a smooth hex bolt friction lock. "What is this?" "Quick adjust wrist collar," Grady said. "Ran it through Halverson's custom device protocol, got it logged as a Class 1 exempt custom fabrication with a physician prescription on file for you. Same friction specs as your stock one, so it'll hold position under load exactly the same, but the knurled ring lets you dial the tension by hand. No hex key, no digging through a drawer mid-task. All the documentation's in the bag if you want to review it before installation." Ronnie stared at the part in her hand, then at the folded paperwork underneath it in the bag. Device history file summary, material certs, the whole proper trail. "You ran this through actual FDA compliance protocols. For me, as a gift. Wasn't going to hand you something that could cost you your license if it failed," Grady said. "Gift or not, it's still a medical device. It gets built the right way, or it doesn't get built at all. You mentioned back in September you hated stopping to loosen a bolt every time you needed a different angle. Been sitting with that a while. Figured I finally had the geometry worked out right." Ronnie stared at the part in her hand, turning it over the same practiced way she checked every piece of hardware that came through her shop, and something in her throat went tight in a way that had nothing to do with a bad fit. "I said that in September, in passing. I don't even remember saying it, honestly. And you've had this sitting in your head for 2 months?" "Wrote it down that same night," Grady admitted. "Didn't know what I was going to do with it at the time. Just knew it bugged you, and I figured out eventually I could probably fix it if I thought about the geometry long enough." "This isn't about my arm," Ronnie said slowly, looking up at him. "This is you answering the actual question from that parking lot. Not with a speech. With this. Didn't think a speech was going to convince you of anything a speech hasn't already failed to convince you of before," Grady said, plain about it. No performance in his voice at all. "Figured showing you I actually listened. 2 months later, on something you mentioned once and never brought up again, might do more than another round of me telling you I'm different." Ronnie fit the new collar onto her prosthetic right there at the counter, testing the tension dial with her good hand, rotating the wrist through its full range without needing a tool at all, smooth and immediate in a way the stock hardware never had been. She worked the ring through its full travel twice, feeling the friction hold firm at every stop point instead of the stock collar's tendency to creep loose after a few weeks of use. The kind of small engineering improvement that would only occur to somebody who'd actually thought hard about failure modes instead of just copying a catalog spec. "It's perfect," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word, which surprised her more than it surprised him. "Wasn't trying to fix you," Grady said, careful with the words. "You're not broken, never thought you were. Just wanted to fix the one specific thing that was actually annoying, because that's what I know how to do. and I figured it said more than anything I could come up with standing in a parking lot. Ronnie set the tension dial one more notch, testing it, and looked up at him with something settling in her expression that hadn't been there in 3 weeks. I've had people offer me sympathy for 6 years, Grady. Pity mostly, dressed up as kindness. Nobody's ever sat with an actual problem I mentioned once and just quietly solved it because they were paying that much attention. She set the wrist down on the counter gently, like it mattered more than a piece of hardware had any right to. That parking lot pause you had, I still don't fully know what that was. But I know what this is. This is somebody who doesn't disappear when it gets complicated, and I've been waiting a long time to actually believe that about somebody. So where's that leave us? Grady asked, careful, not pushing. It leaves us at a support group dinner Thursday night, Ronnie said, something almost teasing creeping into her voice for the first time in 3 weeks. Bunch of amputees, a couple prosthetists, my old rehab cohort. We do it monthly. Mostly just people who've been through the same thing, eating too much pizza and telling terrible jokes about missing limbs that only make sense if you've lived it. You want to actually meet the people whose opinion I care about. That's where they'll be. No pressure. But the invitation's real this time, not a test. I'll be there, Grady said, and this time there was no half-second pause at all. Nothing for Ronnie to catch. Just a plain, immediate answer that told her everything the parking lot conversation hadn't managed to 3 weeks earlier. Thursday night, the group met at a bowling alley's back room that hosted them for free once a month. Folding tables pushed together under fluorescent lights. A dozen people trading stories that ranged from genuinely funny to quietly devastating and back again within the same 5 minutes. The specific camaraderie of people who didn't need to explain the hard parts to each other because everybody at the table already understood them firsthand. A woman named Priscilla, maybe 60, missing 3 fingers from a factory press decades back, spent a solid 10 minutes explaining to a newer member the exact trick to opening a stubborn pickle jar one-handed, and the whole table weighed in with competing methods like it was the most important debate of the year, the kind of ordinary, ridiculous conversation that only happened once everybody in the room had already cleared the much harder conversations a long time ago. Grady showed up on time with a case of soda he'd picked up without being asked, sat where Ronnie pointed, and spent the first 20 minutes mostly listening, careful and genuinely interested, rather than performing comfort he didn't actually feel. It was a guy named Terrence, missing his left leg below the knee since a motorcycle accident 4 years back, who finally put Grady on the spot, grinning across the table with a slice of pizza in one hand. So you're the machinist who's been keeping Ronnie's shop running smooth. She talk your ear off about tolerance specs yet? Or are you two still in the honeymoon phase where that's charming instead of exhausting? Still charming, Grady said without missing a beat, and the table laughed, and Ronnie caught his eye across the folding table with something warm and unguarded in her expression that hadn't fully shown itself since before the parking lot. Grady spent the rest of the night the same way, easy and unbothered, asking real questions instead of careful ones. Laughing at jokes that would have made plenty of people in the room uncomfortable if they hadn't actually earned the right to laugh at them. And by the time the group started breaking up around 9, nobody at that table treated him like an outsider anymore. They walked out to the parking lot together afterward, the same kind of lot where 3 weeks earlier everything had gone quiet and careful, except this time neither of them felt any need to fill the silence with explanations. Terrence likes you, Ronnie said. That's not nothing. He's usually the one who decides in about 90 seconds whether somebody's actually solid or just performing solid. Glad I passed inspection, Grady said. Feels like the kind of tolerance check I can actually respect. Ronnie laughed, real and easy, and reached out with her left hand, the good one, taking his without any hesitation at all, and Grady closed his fingers around hers the same steady way he'd handled every piece of hardware that had ever passed through his shop. Careful, deliberate, built to hold under whatever load came next. They stood there a minute in the mostly empty lot, streetlight buzzing faintly overhead, neither one in any hurry to let go. And for the first time in 3 weeks, Ronnie let herself actually believe that whatever this turned into next, it wasn't going to be the same story she'd already lived through twice before. 6 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, With the shop smelling like resin and fresh coffee the way it always did, Ronnie sat at her workbench, fitting a new patient for a check socket. The quick adjust wrist collar on her own mechanical arm, catching the overhead light as she rotated it into position without reaching for a single tool. Smooth and exact, exactly the way it was built to work. Grady's truck pulled into the lot outside right on schedule. Same crate, same route. And through the window, Ronnie watched him grab the delivery off the tailgate before glancing up and catching her eye through the glass. And neither of them needed to say anything at all. The whole conversation already sitting right there in the easy, unhurried wave he gave her before walking the crate up to the door.